This problem is all around us, but almost no one's paying attention to it. And we're all paying a really, really high cost for this in terms of cancer and likely Parkinson's disease. Only about 13% of people with Parkinson's carry a genetic risk factor for the disease. That means 87% of Americans with Parkinson's have no known genetic cause or genetic risk factor for the disease. The principal causes of many of these brain diseases are not inside of us, they're in our environment. When I was in medical school, my wife said we should buy organic, and I poo-pooed all the ideas. And I used to think that the food we ate, the water we drank, and the air we breathed was safe. I no longer think that. Superfund sites came into public awareness in the 1970s. There's about 1,200 of these sites throughout the country. There's 15 of them on a 7-mile stretch of the 101 freeway in Silicon Valley. Over half these sites are contaminated with trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene. 20 million Americans live within a mile of one of these sites. 70 million, I think, live within 3 miles. And in addition to these Superfund sites, there are thousands of other contaminated sites. This information should be democratized. It should be freely accessible to anyone so we can slow the rate of progression of the disease for those who already have it and make sure that their children and grandchildren never get the disease themselves. Let our generation be the generation that brings about to the fall of Parkinson's disease.
What is Parkinson's disease and why do people need to be aware?
Jesse, great to be with you. Parkinson's is one of the world's fastest growing brain diseases. Classically, it's having two of the following 4 symptoms. First is a tremor, usually at rest, usually in one hand more in the other. The second is slowness in movement. The third is stiffness or rigidity. And the fourth is difficulties with walking or balance. If you have 2 of those 4, say that you have Parkinsonism. The most common cause of Parkinsonism is Parkinson's disease. Dr. Parkinson described it in 1817. He described 6 people with the disease. 200 years later, 6 million people around the world had the disease. And what we've talked about in the past, what hopefully we're going to talk about today, is how did we go from a disease that was rare, not described in the medical literature, affecting 6 people on the streets of London, to a disease that's now you encounter on the streets of, I'll see 6 people on the streets of New York walking home with the disease.
Any optimism about where the direction's going here?
We're going to bring about the fall of Parkinson's disease because people like you are helping get the word out. We're going to bring about the fall of Parkinson's because Parkinson's is largely man-made. Chemicals in our food, water, and air are fueling the rise of these disease. One of these chemicals is a pesticide called paraquat. Yesterday, Vermont became the first state in the union to its legislature passed a ban on this weed killer that's associated with a 150% increased risk of Parkinson's among farmers and associated with a doubling of the risk for people who simply live or work near it, where it's sprayed on fields of corn, cotton, soybeans, and vineyards around the country. Vermont's the first state. Hopefully its governor will sign it. It'll be the first state to ban it. 13 states in all red and blue, including states like Utah and Missouri, have proposed bans on it. If we get rid of the underlying chemicals that are fueling the rise of Parkinson's disease, we create a world that's largely free of this terrible disease.
If you had to guess at this point, what kind of timeline are we hoping for?
I don't think we need to guess. So my colleague Michael and I wrote a book called The Parkinson's Plan, came out last August. And in it, we call for 3 goals by 2035. 0, 10, 100. And the 0 goal is that the rise of Parkinson's disease adjusted for age is 0% by 2035. A 0% rise in the incidence of Parkinson's adjusted for age by 2035. And do the same thing for the rest of the world. So that when you have me on 10 years from now, we start talking about the fall of Parkinson's disease. Now, am I crazy? Quite possibly, but there's evidence. So countries in Western Europe have long since got rid of the weed killer, paraquat. They've gotten rid of this dry thinning degreasing chemical, which is associated with a 500% increased risk of the disease. And their skies over England and the Netherlands and Germany is all much better than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. The number of new cases in England is stable or falling. The number of new cases of Parkinson's adjusted for age in the Netherlands is stable or falling. In Germany, it's falling. The world's fastest growing brain disease, the fall of it has begun in Germany. If the Germans can do it, if the Dutch can do it, if the British can do it, then certainly Americans can do it, and we can help lead the entire world into a future where Parkinson's disease is extraordinarily rare, just as it has been likely for 99.9% of human history.
You quickly held up a molecule there. Talk more about that.
So this molecule is a trichloroethylene, so little high school chemistry, hopefully no flashbacks for people. So water is made up of 3 atoms, H2O, 2 hydrogens, and 1 oxygen. Trichloroethylene is made up of 6 atoms, 2 carbons in black, 1 hydrogen in white, and 3 chlorines in blue, hence its name, trichloroethylene. It's got a cousin called perchloroethylene, and unfortunately, almost all of us have been exposed to these chemicals, and almost all of us know nothing about it. I didn't know much, if anything, about these chemicals until about 10 years ago. These chemicals are associated with a 500% increased risk of developing Parkinson's, according to a small twin study. In the lab, these chemicals reproduce the features of Parkinson's disease. Certainly, trichloroethylene does. These chemicals, trichloroethylene is known to cause cancer. Among the cancers linked to it are kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, multiple myeloma, leukemia in children, prostate cancer, brain cancer, and perchloroethylene likely causes cancer. And a lot of us have been exposed to it. In 1970, there were 2 pounds of trichloroethylene per American, 500 million pounds of the chemical used. Estimated 10 million people worked with it, and everything from printers and painters, varnish workers, dry cleaners, mechanics, varnish workers, all worked with it. Then it's widely contaminated the military bases throughout the United States. Half of the most toxic sites in the country, called Superfund sites, are contaminated with it. And people were exposed to it in consumer products, everything from carpet cleaners to gun cleaners, typewriter correction fluid, and even in decaffeinated coffee in the 1970s. In our book, we detail how people were exposed to these chemicals in their water and the indoor air, because these chemicals can readily evaporate. And I think this might be one of the most important causes of Parkinson's in the U.S.
Somebody now aware of these 2 chemicals, how do they test or assess their environment to see if they're being exposed?
There are things that you can do to just reduce your exposure at the outset. So you can get a green dry cleaner, a dry cleaner that does not use perchloroethylene, often called perc in the industry. You can put a water filter or a carbon filter. You can get it at the grocery store to decrease the exposure to these chemicals in your water. If you live near a contaminated site, you can test your indoor air. There are companies. One's called Simple Lab. I have no affiliation with them, where you can get your indoor air tested for these chemicals. You can test your water for these chemicals. You can either do that through your municipality or also through this company and others that can test your water for these chemicals. Turns out that 40 million Americans, 1 in 8 Americans, get their water from wells. And wells aren't regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act and are infrequently tested, usually only when you buy or sell your home. And when they're tested, they're generally tested for bacteria, which is important so you don't get diarrhea. But they're generally not tested for pesticides, which might be really important in rural areas. And they're not tested for chemicals like trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene routinely, which might be really important if you're in suburban or urban areas.
You quickly mentioned Superfund sites there, and these are sites in the US that are affected by the PCE or TCE. People can go online, see how close they are. And the way I understand it, the people responsible for the contamination are being held responsible, and they need to clean it up.
Yeah. And so like the Superfund sites came into the public awareness in the 1970s. Love Canal, not too far from where I used to live in Rochester, New York, was contaminated with trichloroethylene and other chemicals that a chemical firm had largely dumped into a canal that was in a development that was supposed to be like the suburban area of the future. Unfortunately, it wasn't. The future wasn't good for many of these individuals because the chemicals started coming up from their soil, coming into their basement, and it actually led to evacuation of some neighborhoods in the 1970s. Led President Carter and others to create a Superfund Act that designated these sites for federal cleanup and to try to hold the wrongdoers accountable for them. There's about 1,200 of these sites throughout the country. There's 15 of them on a 7-mile stretch of the 101 freeway in Silicon Valley. because this chemical was used to clean off silicon wafers there. Over half these sites are contaminated with trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene. And lest you think this is somebody else's problem, it turns out that 20 million Americans live within a mile of one of these sites. 70 million, I think, live within 3 miles. And in addition to these 1,200 or so Superfund sites, there are thousands of other contaminated sites. Where I lived in suburban Rochester, where all the doctors and lawyers lived, I, I was within 5 to 10 minutes of 4 sites that were contaminated with either trichloroethylene and or perchloroethylene, including 3 dry cleaners. I'm here in New York City living, and, Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn is contaminated with these chemicals. And they found these chemicals in the indoor air of residences in Brooklyn. So this problem is all around us, but almost no one's paying attention to it. And we're all paying a really, really, really high cost for this in terms of cancer and likely Parkinson's disease.
You mentioned there quickly that people aren't paying attention. How many people living nearby one of these sites do you think are aware of it?
I think very few. I'll give you an example. So, here I am, a neurologist, been writing about this. And I said to myself, where's the last place in the world that I'm going to find trifluoroethylene? And I went to high school in Newport Beach, California. And I said, Newport Beach, California, last place in the world to find trichloroethylene. So I did a very sophisticated research study. I typed in trichloroethylene and Newport Beach into Google, and I hit return. And it turned out that within a quarter mile of where I went to high school, at Cronin High School, there was a former aerospace facility that had been contaminated with these chemicals. And there were multi-million-dollar homes hundreds of yards away from where I went to high school in Newport Beach, California, that were sitting on top of soil that was contaminated with these chemicals. And these chemicals had been found in the indoor air in people's master bedrooms, in their living rooms, and in kids' playrooms. And I think most people, even today, many of the people who live in this community in Newport Beach, about 3 miles from Pacific Ocean, are unaware of these contamination.
Okay, so you mentioned there's a ton of these throughout the US. How long does it take to clean them up? And how many of them are being actively cleaned? And how many of them are just marked off for people to know?
It's hard to clean them up. I'm a neurologist, not a toxicologist, not an environmental scientist, but it's pretty easy to prevent people from getting exposed. So water filters can help. Changing your municipalities can change their water sources if that's the issue. In many cases, the water that people are getting is not coming from underneath their homes, so it's sometimes not an issue. The other issue is this. It's called vapor intrusion. These chemicals evaporate like radon. Many people know that radon can be found in your soil and can enter your basement, and it can cause lung cancer. So you test for it. And if you're radon in your basement, it's not a terrible big deal because you can put a remediation system in that basically sucks the air from underneath your foundation and vents the radon above your roof, preventing the radon from entering your home. The same thing can be done for people who live on top of these plumes of trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene. You can test your indoor air. If it's elevated, you can put this basically a radon remediation system that sucks the air from underneath your foundation, vents it above the roof to prevent exposure to it. Cleanup is hard and it's long and it's all I'll just say that there are great people and there are great public health experts and environmental scientists working to ensure the health and well-being of us and our communities. But I would also say that there are strong financial incentives to underplay, downplay, hide, not draw attention to these contaminations when they are found or known. And that cleanup takes years, decades, and oftentimes is hidden, risks, or downplayed almost all the time. I get communications almost every week from someone in Maryland, someone in Arizona, who I think might have got their Parkinson's disease from exposure to these chemicals in their community. And just these concerns aren't being addressed. If you step back, we should ask, why are Parkinson's getting more common? Why are people under 50 getting more colon cancer? Why are 131 children getting autism? Why are 1 in 3 85-year-olds getting Alzheimer's disease? Diseases have causes, And our job as neurologists, as scientists, as physicians is to find out those causes so we can prevent people from ever getting these diseases in the first place.
I'm sure a lot of people tuning in today are going to be wondering how close they are to one of these sites. Is there one website people can go to and put in like their zip code and see?
Yeah, so EPA has a site to find this if you live near a Superfund site. So you can find that many state departments of state EPAs, or sometimes called Department of Environmental Conservation. Some have maps. We actually provided a map in our book for people who live in Rochester, New York. It's on page 46. And so you can see that in Rochester, New York, we found over 100 contaminated sites with trichloroethylene or perchloroethylene in Rochester, New York, including the 4 that I mentioned were near where I lived. I'm working with a great geographer at the Atria Health and Research Institute, Brittany Krasnowski, and we're trying to create an environmental health score first for Los Angeles, where that anyone in Los Angeles, for example, can put in their home address and be told what the health is of their home, of that community, based on air quality, water quality, proximity to the Superfund sites, proximity to golf courses, proximity to other toxic sites, so people can have a better sense of what the health is of their environment.
Okay, so somebody finds out they're close to one of these sites. Me personally, I'm going to be trying to come up with a game plan to get out of there. Not everybody's going to have that opportunity. I just want to make sure we cover all the bases. Somebody who can't leave, they know they're going to be there long term, but they know their area is affected. It's in the air, it's in the water. You mentioned the system that we can put in for the air in the house, filtering water. If we do those to the best of our ability, does that bring our exposure down to 0? And then is there any other areas we want to make sure we're looking at and rectifying?
Yeah, so 0 is a tough one. But I'll tell you a story. Jane Horton lives in Mountain View, California. She lives across the street from a site that was a Superfund site from both Fairchild Semiconductor and Intel. I think those are the companies, because they had used companies like them had used a trichloroethylene to clean out silicon wafers. She had her indoor air tested in her home, and it was found to be elevated. And she had this remediation system put into her home that sucks the air from underneath her foundation, vents it above. And she has her home regularly tested for air quality. And she says she has the cleanest air of any home in Mountain View, California. So this is definitely possible, and it's done all the time. We do it for radon. Many of our listeners have had radon remediation systems put into their homes, and they're breathing air that's largely free of radon. So it's certainly doable. In our book, we give at the back of the book, for people who do not want to get Parkinson's or those who already have it, on page 237, we give people the Parkinson's 25 actions people can take in their everyday life to reduce their risk of getting exposed to these chemicals linked to Parkinson's. We talk about, checking your well, which is number 8, using a water filter, which is number 9, choosing your home carefully, which is number 12. So we give you very practical things. As a Reader's Digest version, it'll take you 10 or 15 minutes to read. It's got lots of pictures. So if people aren't book people and they just want to get to the bottom line, what can they do to reduce their risk of Parkinson's? Or if they already have Parkinson's, they're among the 1.2 million Americans with the disease, what can they do to possibly slow it? We give you 25 recommendations in the back of the book, and then we give you references and resources to investigate further.
Okay, when an area is deemed a Superfund site, is that just related to the TCE and PCE, or is other chemicals under that umbrella?
It can be others, so like hexachromium from who is the woman who did the Aaron Brockovich. So there are other chemicals that can also be responsible for the contamination of Superfund sites. They're not all trichloroethylene or perchloroethylene, but over half are. So if we want to create a world where cancer is being prevented instead of just being treated, if we want to create a world where Parkinson's is being prevented instead of just treated, if we want to create a world where people aren't getting these diseases in the first place so they don't have to spend their time and money at doctors' offices and hospitals, we can prevent these diseases by removing exposure to these chemicals. Just like very relatively few people are have lead poisoning. But, when I was a kid, 95% of American children had unsafe levels of lead in the 1970s. We got rid of leaded paint. We got rid of leaded gasoline. And all of a sudden, lead levels are 95% lower. And children today are 3 to 4 IQ points smarter because we got rid of lead and gasoline. 3 to 4 points smarter because we got rid of lead and gasoline. What happens if we got rid of these degreasing chemicals in dry cleaning or in industrial sites? What happens if we stop spraying weed killers linked to Parkinson's disease on farms? What would happen? We can create a world where these diseases are increasingly rare instead of increasingly common.
Okay, you mentioned well water. So people that are drinking from a well want to have it tested. What about municipal water? Are they testing for these things?
So municipal water should be regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, 1973. I think this is when President Richard Nixon's president of the United States, passed the Safe Drinking Water Act, which requires municipalities to test the water that, most of us are drinking. And so they should be tested. Now, it turns out that standards in general have gotten stricter over time. So I say, why wait for the standards to become stricter? Why not get ahead of the curve and reduce your exposure to these chemicals? So when I was in Rochester, New York, I put a carbon filter on my kitchen faucet. And now I have a water tank in New York City, and I fill it up with water that goes through a carbon filter. And then I drink the water from underneath that. When I was in medical school, my wife said we should buy organic, and she'd tell me all these things, and I poo-pooed all the ideas. And I used to think that the food we ate, the water we drank, and the air we breathed was safe. I no longer think that. And so I take actions in my own life, and we give you the actions, basically the actions I take in my own life. Many of them are in the book, 25 actions to reduce your risk to these chemicals in your food, water, and air, so you can live a life that's with a reduced risk of ever getting terrible brain diseases like Parkinson's.
You mentioned military sites. Let's bring those in and talk about what happened there.
Yeah, so I think as many of you know about Camp Lejeune. So Camp Lejeune, for those who don't, it's a Marine base in North Carolina. If you're a Marine, many that you go into training, and you're either trained on the West Coast at Camp Pendleton or on the East Coast at Camp Lejeune. And Marine, especially the officers, need to have their uniforms dry cleaned. They got to look good. And it turned out there was a dry cleaner on right near the base at Camp Lejeune. And the dry cleaning chemicals from that dry cleaning site were inappropriately disposed of or leaked, and they contaminated the drinking water at the Marine base. And there were other sources of contamination, but the water was contaminated from 1953 to 1987. For 25 years, 1 million Marines, their spouses, their children, and civilians were exposed to a cancer-causing chemical in their drinking water, and to a chemical that's associated with a 500% increased risk of developing the disease. For the latter years, the Marine Corps knew about this contamination and did nothing. It took an act of Congress to force the Marine Corps to notify Marines of their exposure so they could take actions to reduce their risk. My colleagues, Drs. Caroline Tanner and Sam Goldman at UC San Francisco, look at the risk of Parkinson's among the Marines who served at Camp Lejeune. Marines, almost by definition, are healthy, almost by definition young. The average age was 20. Some were teenagers. Yet 34 years later, the Marines at Camp Lejeune had a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's compared to Marines who served at a less contaminated Camp Pendleton. The seeds of these adult onset brain diseases are planted early, and they're preventable. Parkinson's disease is not a natural consequence of aging. It is an unnatural consequence of aging. You put a mouse in the laboratory and you let it age, it will never spontaneously develop Parkinson's disease, or for that matter, Alzheimer's disease. The only way that mouse develops Parkinson's disease is if you expose it to toxic chemicals like paraquat or trichloroethylene, or manipulate its genes.
You highlighted Camp Lejeune and the dry cleaning. How many military sites were impacted?
In our book, the two protagonists of our book are Drs. Sarah Winningham and Jana Reed. Both were young women when they went to the U.S. Air Force Academy, were athletes, ran on the track team. Both became physicians. They served their country around the world, including in Afghanistan. Both became mothers, and both in their 40s were diagnosed with Parkinson's within 1 month of each other. I asked them if they could send me a list of all the bases where they served. and when they served. And then I went and saw which were contaminated. I know some people are listening, not watching, but for those who are listening, if you're in the Marines or in the military, you're only at a base for like 1 or 2 years or 3 years, and then you move around. And they gave me a list, each of them, Drs. Jana Reed and Dr. Sarah Winningham, both had served about 10 different Marine bases around the country. At least half of them we found were contaminated with trichloroethylene. Uh, and we think that trichloroethylene played a role in both of their diseases. Um, this is a really high price for people to pay. People who sign up to serve our country do so knowing that they have a risk of danger and harm from the enemy, but they don't want to be signing up, at least Dr. Winningham has articulated this far better than I am, to sign up to be exposed to chemicals from the military itself. And we can take action to prevent people like Janet Reed and Sarah Winningham from developing these terrible diseases, not from combat, not from actions by the enemy, but from actions by the United States. If these chemicals are unsafe to be used in Europe, if some of these weed killers are unsafe to be used in China, we should not be using in the United States. We have great chemists. We have great engineers. We can come up with safer chemicals that allow us to live lives without getting Parkinson's disease and without getting cancer.
For somebody that has been at one of the bases you list there, are there any class action lawsuits to sue? Because you mentioned there, at least with Camp Lejeune, they knew it was happening and didn't disclose.
Yeah, so the Camp Lejeune became on the radar screen because Janie Insminger was a 6-year-old girl at Camp Lejeune when her father, Jerry Insminger, was a Marine drill instructor there. And at age 6, she developed leukemia, and she died at age 9. And her death strained his relationship with his other daughters and really tore apart the family. He ended up divorcing his wife. And then he found out, listening to local news while getting a plate of spaghetti out of the microwave, that a cancer-causing chemical had been found at Camp Lejeune. He then dropped his plate of spaghetti, and then he thought about his daughter, and then he thought about all those who had been, who he had trained. And he had trained them to be Marines, and that you leave no Marine behind. So after 24 years serving our country as a Marine, he's devoted the last 27 plus years and counting to bring justice for those that he trained, for their children, for their daughters, for their sons, and for the civilians who work there. And we now have the Janie Insminger Act that provides benefits to Marines who serve there. And the Camp Lejeune Justice Act, Senator Tom Tillis, among others, helped us get this passed, which allows Marines to sue the federal government for damages as a result of their exposure to these chemicals. So there are lawsuits that are happening. I think when you see these class action lawsuits, you see these because we have failed as a society to protect citizens. We failed to protect Marines. We failed to protect Janie Insminger. We failed to protect Dr. Jana Reed. We failed to protect Dr. Sarah Winningham. These failures need to end. When these failures end, people like these individuals don't suffer with cancer, don't suffer with Parkinson's disease, and don't die prematurely.
When it comes to TCE and PCE, how much of the problem is from our previous use versus current use? And then where currently are they still being used, given this information you're bringing forth about the problems?
For Parkinson's disease, let me just back up. So if you get diagnosed with lung cancer due to smoking at, say, 60, it's not because you started smoking at 60 or 59 or 58. It's because you're likely smoking when you're a teenager in your 20s. And I think the same is true for Parkinson's disease. Dr. Jana Reed and Sarah Winningham developed Parkinson's disease in their 40s, not because they worked with the chemical in their 40s, but because they worked with the chemical or were exposed to the chemical in their 20s or thereabout. So I think there's a lag between these exposures and the development of the disease, which makes research studies really hard and makes it really hard for people to even associate it. Why would you associate getting Parkinson's disease at age 40 with what you were doing when you were in your 20s? So it's hard to make those associations, but that's one of the challenges that we need to overcome. And then you said other sites.
I wanted to know who's still using these
Oh, still
chemicals.
using, yeah. So in 2024, the EPA banned both trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene. Um, in 2025, those bans were frozen. The fate of those bans is still uncertain to me. My understanding is that 60% of dry cleaners in the United States still use perchloroethylene. Only one state, California, has banned the use of perchloroethylene in dry cleaning. So I tell people to get a green dry cleaner. Dry cleaner does not use perchloroethylene, often called perc in the industry. Use of trichloroethylene has decreased, but I think the latest data I saw says 250 million pounds still used in the U.S., about 1 pound per American, or at least 1 pound per adult. And two states, New York, where I am, and Minnesota, have banned these chemicals here. These chemicals have largely been banned in Europe, but we're still using them here, even though some companies have advertised safer alternatives.
Given the danger of the Superfund sites, though, even them being banned is the first step, but also if there was contamination in the past, it sounds like that's not naturally cleaning itself up, and it's
Yeah.
actually hard to clean up. Is there a half-life on these chemicals?
Yeah, so there is I can't give it, but they decay really, really slowly. And so they remain a problem. There's a plume, a 4 by 2 mile plume in Long Island, not too far from where I'm sitting here in Manhattan, from a former aerospace facility. And there are hundreds, thousands of people who live about this plume. Um, the EPA administrator is from Long Island. The EPA administrator, this is public information, had leukemia. I wonder, for example, was he exposed to cancer-causing chemicals in Long Island that might have contributed to his cancer? Diseases have causes. Diseases have causes. If you get diagnosed with a disease, one of the first questions you should ask your doctor is, why did I get this disease? Because if you figure that out, one, you're in much better position to treat it, because the cause of disease, the cause of disease might dictate the appropriate treatment. You're positioned to slow your rate of progression and make sure you stop getting exposed to these chemicals, and you're positioned to prevent your family members from ever getting affected. Diseases have causes. We should find out what these causes are. And there are reasons why 1 in 31 8-year-old children have autism. There are reasons why young women are developing ALS. There are reasons that Parkinson's is one of the world's fastest growing brain diseases. And there are reasons why 1 in 3 85-year-olds are getting Alzheimer's disease in the US. And these are not natural. They are unnatural. Brain diseases now are the world's leading source of disability and the leading source of disability in the United States. That has never been the case in human history. It has never been the case in human history that brain diseases are the leading source of disability, and that has now happened. We need to figure out why, so we can change the course of these diseases and prevent people from suffering from these terrible conditions.
I'd have to imagine, if it hasn't already started, that when people become aware of what we're talking about today in these Superfund sites, that's going to affect real estate. And people that have bought homes, you mentioned before, $1 million homes, and they think they have this asset, and then later on find out that, they're right over top all these chemicals. I could see how that's going to cause a lot of problems.
Yes, and that's why wrongdoers should be held accountable. Um, and they should be held accountable. And the falls in real estate prices are nothing compared to cancer in a child.
Okay, so you mentioned the fact that dry cleaners are still using. Is it just PC at this point,
Generally,
or both TC?
I'm a neurologist, not a dry cleaning expert. My understanding is that, well, for those who like to listen, so dry cleaning was started in like the 1880s, 1890s, and we used things like kerosene, which had this unfortunate property of being flammable, not too great. So in the 1930s, trichloroethylene was developed. So trichloroethylene's been around for about 100 years. It's known to cause cancer. That means it's been causing cancer for 100 years. Approximately, in the United States. And then in the 1950s, it was supplanted by perchloroethylene, which is still a widely used dry cleaning agent, actually both in the United States and apparently in Europe.
Okay, just to be clear then, is TC being used in the US at this point?
I don't think not for dry cleaning, to my knowledge. Again, I can be wrong. I'm a neurologist. But it is used in other things. Its big uses at degreasing, especially metal, is its one of among its most common uses. But I told you it's been used in embalming. It's been used to decaffeinate coffee. It was used as an anesthetic agent in the 1950s and 1960s. Women could self-administer the anesthetic in a canister, and then they lose consciousness, and then they drop the canister. So yeah.
And we want to also point out that you mentioned switching your dry cleaner to one of these non-chemical ones, which is a great step. But for people that live by a dry cleaner, they, in my mind, need to treat that as a Superfund site, a mini Superfund site. If you have one across the street from your home, you're in proximity to what sounds like the PCE.
Yeah, so they did a study looking, I think New York State Department of Health or New York Department of Environmental Conservation looked at homes, I think in the 1990s in New York City and in Albany that were located above dry cleaners. So many people who live in high rises, it used to be that there was a dry cleaner at the bottom of the high rise because you drop off your dry clean on your way to work, for example, and pick it up when you're coming home. And they found that 24 or 29 apartments in New York that were located above a dry cleaner had unsafe levels of the chemical perchloroethylene in their indoor air. And because the chemical is fat loving, they found it in the butter and in the cheese in the refrigerator in those apartments. Similar studies have been done in Germany where they found the dry cleaning chemicals in the dairy products in grocery stores near dry cleaners. And now there are really strict regulations and not a ban on proximity of dry cleaners to grocery stores. One of my colleagues, Elmer Diaz, one of these great public servants, works for the Department of Health in Washington State. And he identified, I think, 80 child daycare centers that were located near dry cleaners in Washington State. And he's taking action to ensure that those children in those daycare centers are not exposed to this cancer-causing chemical or this likely carcinogen in the case of perchloroethylene in Washington State.
A lot to think about then. Daycare, schools, places of work, grocery stores that are near dry cleaners. You might not even live near the grocery store, but you're stopping there and getting your butter or your milk, and the chemicals can be in there. Your home, if you're in an apartment, you might be above one of these. So not to scare people, but just to turn people on to the different areas they need to be thinking about to protect you and your family.
Yeah, you're scaring me. But our book's really about message is around hope. And that means that diseases have causes. We figure out what these causes are. You take action to prevent your children, your grandchildren, your family members from getting affected by these terrible diseases. And it's not just Parkinson's disease. I told you about the link to cancer. Trifluorethylene has been linked to congenital heart disease. It's been linked to miscarriages. It's been linked to autoimmune diseases. And that's just one of these chemicals. We haven't even talked about pesticides and the chemicals of the diseases that they're linked to. But I think there's just a general increasing awareness and awakening, if you will, in the public that these diseases have causes and that one of the underlying causes for these things are chemicals in our environment. For people with Parkinson's, only about 13% of people with Parkinson's carry a genetic cause or genetic risk factor for the disease. Only 13%. That means 87% of Americans with Parkinson's have no known genetic cause or genetic risk factor for disease. The principal causes of many of these brain diseases are not inside of us. They're not in our DNA. They're not in our cells. They're in our environment. If we want to create a world where people live long, healthy lives free of these neurological disorders, and when we create a world where we're not spending hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars on Alzheimer's disease, tens of billions of dollars on Parkinson's disease, billions of dollars on ALS, we can do that by stopping use of these chemicals that are linked to these diseases.
Okay, so good news. Genetics don't play a big role here.
Yeah, for Alzheimer's disease, it's not like it's among the least heritable of all diseases. And ALS is similarly, only about 10% of people carry a genetic risk factor for the disease. 10 to 15% are considered familial. 85% of ALS or 90% is considered sporadic or likely due, I think, to environmental causes. Even Alzheimer's disease, some of your listeners know that there are variations in the gene called ApoE that can put people at increased risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. But even those alleles, one, they might be tied to, might put people at higher risk if they're exposed to these chemicals, like ApoE, and air pollution might amplify your risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. And then a large number of people with Alzheimer's disease have no known genetic causes. And single genetic causes for these diseases is extraordinarily rare, under 10%, some cases under 1 or 2%. The vast majority of people getting diseases is due to environment. My colleague, Dr. Bruce Lamphere, who's did a lot of great work on lead toxicity in children, says, Ray, in the end, most of us are going to die from an environmentally related disease. I would like to not die from an environmentally related disease, or if I do, I want to die after I've had a chance to live a long and healthy, productive life. And we can do that by getting rid of these chemicals in our environment.
Zooming in on Parkinson's, what are the genes at play there that increase risk? Again, with the caveat, this isn't a big player, but just to cover it. And then how much does that increase risk?
Let's look at this great study led by the Parkinson's Foundation, offers free genetic counseling, genetic testing to anyone in the United States and several other countries. Over 32,000 people have signed up. The study's called PD Generation, Generation. You can just Google it and you can sign up to participate if you have Parkinson's disease. And they looked at the results from the first 8,000 participants, published it in Brain, one of our top journals, in 2024. Of these 8,000 individuals, many of them Americans, 13% carry a genetic cause or genetic risk factor. The most common genetic risk factor are mutations in a gene called GBA1. About 8% of Americans in this study carry this genetic risk factor. If you carry this genetic risk factor, your lifetime risk of getting Parkinson's is 10%. So another way, the vast majority of people who carry the most common genetic risk factor for disease will not develop the disease. Now, what determines who develops the disease and who does, we're not certain. But research, again, by Dr. Caroline Tanner and her colleague, Dr. Ethan Brown at UCSF, showed that people who carry this genetic mutations in this gene and are exposed to pesticides have a much heightened risk for developing the disease. So if you carry these genetic risk factors, GBA1, you should be especially concerned about getting exposed to pesticides and take actions to mitigate your risk. That's the most common genetic risk factor. What's the most common genetic cause or mutation? It's mutations in a gene called LRRK2, LRRK2. Affects about, 2 to 3% of Americans with it. If you carry mutations in that gene, your lifetime risk of developing Parkinson's, depending on the study, is upwards of 40%. Said another way, the majority of people with the most common genetic cause of Parkinson's disease do not develop Parkinson's disease. The majority of the people with the most common genetic cause of Parkinson's disease do not develop Parkinson's disease, suggesting that there have to be other factors that play a role. Turns out that mutations in that gene LRRK2 increase the activity of a protein that's called LRRK2. It also turns out that trichloroethylene, according to research done by my colleague, Dr. Brianna D. Miranda, that trichloroethylene mimics the effects of this genetic mutation by also increasing the activity of LRRK2, this protein called LRRK2. So the most common genetic cause of the disease and what I think might be the most common environmental cause of the disease both act in a similar way to increase the activity of the same protein.
So we know now environmental toxins, big player in this. Let's talk about the physiology, whether it be food, air, water. When these chemicals come into the body, take me through how that leads to Parkinson's.
Yeah. So when Dr. Parkinson described the disease in 1817, he wasn't sure where the disease began. He thought it might begin in part of the brain. And he said he looked forward to anatomists who would determine where the disease began. In 2003, a really, really smart German pathologist named Heiko Brock came up with a new idea. He said that Parkinson's disease does not begin in the brain. He said that Parkinson's disease, which we think of as brain disease, does not begin in the brain. He said, after I looked at hundreds of brains, I see that the pathology of Parkinson's disease, a misfolded protein, I see it beginning in either the smell center behind our nose, called the olfactory bulb, or I see it in cells that give rise to the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, as some of your listeners know, goes from the lower part of your brainstem all the way down to your gut. It's like 2 feet long, depending on how tall you are. And so he thought that Parkinson's was due to neural invasion of some kind of pathogen. He thought a virus. A virus has probably played a small role in most cases of Parkinson's, but a pathogen that crosses in from the gut and crosses the membrane of the gut leads to the pathology of the disease. And as the pathology of the disease spread up the vagus nerve and up through the brain, as the pathology spread like a fall of a row of dominoes, new symptoms would appear. If you damage the vagus nerve, which is responsible for digesting your food, you get constipation. The pathology then can spread from the lower part of the brainstem a little bit higher. Right above it are our sleep centers. If the pathology spreads towards sleep centers, we get fragmented sleep. We get people acting out their dreams at night, perhaps striking their bed partner, called REM sleep behavior disorder. A little bit higher from the sleep center are the part of the brain that's classically affected in Parkinson's disease, called the substantia nigra, which gives us either tremor and slowness and movement. And then as you spread up further and further, you get to the parts of the brain that are responsible for thinking. And then late in the course of the disease, you might get troubles with thinking and dementia. The spread of a falling row of dominoes, the pathology spreads. And as the pathology spreads, so do the symptoms. So that begins in the gut. So in 2019, a really smart colleague of mine, Dr. Per Borkhammer in Denmark, said there are 2 forms of the disease of Parkinson's and related diseases. There is this gut first form of disease. He calls it a body first form of disease that Dr. Brock described, beginning with the vagus nerve. And he said there is a nose or brain first form of disease that begins in the smell center of the brain. Dr. Brock didn't make much of the pathology beginning in the nose, but Dr. Borkhammer thinks that for most people with Parkinson's, it might be even more important, and that it can spread the pathology from the smell center backwards to the part of the brain that's controlled in mood, called the amygdala, and part of the brain that controls movements, the substantia nigra. 2 forms of the disease, one beginning in the gut, body first form of Parkinson's disease, one beginning in the nose, brain first form of the disease. I sent him an email saying this is outstanding work. Congratulations. How does this fit with chemicals that we ingest, that we eat, that we swallow, like the Marines at Camp Lejeune drinking the contaminated well water, leading to a gut or body first form of the disease, and chemicals that we inhale, like the fields being sprayed with paraquat, leading to a nose or brain first form of the disease? He said he hadn't thought about it, but we put this hypothesis together, saying that chemicals we ingest lead to a gut or body first form of the disease, chemicals that we inhale leading to a nose or brain first form of the disease.
And depending on the mode of getting Parkinson's, how different are signs and symptoms later on?
Yeah, so if you start in the gut, you get early constipation, then it spreads up to the part of the brain that controls sleep. You get sleep disturbances, then it spreads up to the part of the brain that controls tremor, and you get tremor. It also affects parts of the nervous system that we don't control, like the autonomic nervous system. So people might get lightheadedness or something like that. Conversely, if it begins in the nose, one of the earliest features of the disease might be loss of smell. I told you it goes to the amygdala, which might be involved in mood. So you might get a little anxiety, and then it goes back to the brain. Importantly, he thinks that the disease generally begins in a single locus. It's not spread all over, so that when it begins in a single locus, single site, that means that, for example, that most of that Parkinson's for people who begin in the nose is really asymmetric, because 99% of nerve cells connect to the other nerve cells on the same hemisphere of the brain. And so people get this asymmetric tremor that's much worse on one side of the body than on the other side of the body. And then only later in the course of disease does the other side get affected. So his mapping, which has been supported by pathological studies and imaging studies, and people are still living, we can image different parts of the nervous system, really plays well with what we know about the natural history of the disease.
Okay, so it sounds like, by what you just said there, if our origin is through the nose, that one side will be affected, at least earlier on, versus the gut, would be more
So the gut, it turns out
centralized?
the gut, sorry, a little extra neurology. I had to review this. It turns out the gut is that it's innervated by the vagus nerve on you have two nerves. You have a right vagus nerve and a left vagus nerve, just like you have a right ulnar nerve and a left ulnar nerve. You have a right vagus nerve and a left vagus nerve. Turns out that both vagus nerves go to the gut, so that the pathology begins in the gut. It can spread up both the right vagus nerve and the left vagus nerve. So people who have a gut first form of Parkinson's disease, this is hypothesis, is that their Parkinson's will be relatively symmetric or less asymmetric than people who begin with a nose, where 99% of the neurons are connecting to nerve cells on the same side of the brain.
Okay. Since the prognosis takes so long after our initial exposure, somebody say they've been to one of the Marine bases, but they're still feeling healthy, but they feel like they're exposed, or they grew up by a field where farmers were spraying right in their vicinity. What I'm getting at with all this, before they get Parkinson's, knowing they've likely had exposures to these chemicals, has there been any research showing detox protocols are helpful, removing them before problems fully arise?
No, in short, no one's like this hypothesis. Dr. Borkheimer was 2019, but that's a great idea. And there are studies, Michael J. Fox Foundation, working on trials that would give you treatments, drugs, for example, to see if this can prevent onset of disease. Now, people are looking for sort of solutions that don't require drugs, right? And, people don't want to be patients. So what can we do? I think we can stop getting exposed to these chemicals. So I don't think if you drink well water when you were young, if you breathe in pesticides because you live near a golf course or a farm, if you served at a contaminated bait, I don't think it's a fait accompli that you're necessarily going to develop the disease. And I'll give you an example. So if you smoke cigarettes, it's not a fait accompli, when you smoke cigarettes in your 20s that you're going to get lung cancer in your 60s. Turns out within hours of smoking your last cigarette, your heart rate normalizes. Within days, your carbon monoxide levels in your blood decrease. Within months, your cough and shortness of breath decrease. Within a year, your risk of heart attack is lower. And within 10 years of smoking your last cigarette, your risk of lung cancer is halved. If this is true for smoking and lung cancer, why wouldn't this be true for getting exposed to these chemicals and Parkinson's disease? I think if you've had these early exposures in childhood, as a young adult, as a teenager, you want to take action right now to stop getting exposed to these chemicals. So you stop fueling the fire. So you stop letting the spread of this pathology go up your vagus nerve or from your nose back to the part of the brain that's classically affected in Parkinson's. We also know that exercise, for example, can reduce your risk of developing disease. Exercise releases growth factors in the brain that might be really important if you've had these early exposures. We know that a Mediterranean diet, low in animal products, high in fruits and vegetables, is associated with a decreased risk of developing disease. So I think there's lots of non-pharmacological interventions that are logically, and there is evidence for these things playing a role in reducing your risk of getting disease, and might be especially important if you've had these exposures to these chemicals, or you're the child of someone with Parkinson's disease, for example.
What I was getting at, though, we know TCE, PCE, they build up in the fat tissue. And say somebody knows that their fat tissue is likely loaded with these, but their substantia nigra isn't yet destroyed. And say they're in that 10-year period before they have major problems and they have full-on Parkinson's, things like saunas, binders, getting the chemicals out of the body before they have full-on Parkinson's. Any research there?
Largely, no. I'll give you something. So I've been looking at ALS, and turns out the environmental risk factors for Parkinson's disease, air pollution, solvents, dry cleaning chemicals, pesticides, and heavy metals are in many cases very similar to the environmental risk factors for Parkinson's disease. One of the kings of neurology was this neurologist named Dr. Lewis or Bud Rowland. He was so eminent that he was the chair of Department of Neurology at Columbia University. And before he was the chair of neurology at Columbia University, he was the chair of neurology at the department at the University of Pennsylvania. And in the 1970s, he described the case of ALS that was due to lead poisoning. The person had worked in a battery plant for 30 years before being diagnosed with ALS at age 50. He came under his care and then of his colleagues a year later when he was 51. And he gives this person a chelating agent called penicillamine to reduce his lead levels were elevated and it reduced his lead levels of elevation and his weakness got better. I think we need to do the research that you're exactly suggesting that we do. What are the interventions that we can do for people who have been exposed, people who are at high risk for developing these conditions? Why aren't we measuring these chemicals in people's bodies? If we know that pesticides, dry cleaning chemicals, air pollutants, metals are linked to Parkinson's, which they are, why aren't we measuring these chemicals in people's bodies? We measure cholesterol in 50,000 different variations of cholesterol every day. We measure hemoglobin A1C every day. Why aren't we measuring these chemicals that we know are linked to Parkinson's and to ALS and to Alzheimer's disease so we can take action? One, find out if we're at risk, and then two, study interventions to reduce these levels in our bodies so we can create a world where we can prevent these diseases from ever occurring in the first place. We just haven't done it. There's no money being done to this. Out of every Parkinson's research dollar, only 2 pennies is spent on trying to prevent the disease. 60% of biomedical research funding in the United States is from pharmaceutical firms and medical device firms. And they're largely in there, trying to come up with new treatments to the disease. And we're getting better treatments for cancer and the like. But I think what people want is they don't want to be cured of their breast cancer. They don't want to be cured of their prostate cancer. They just don't want to get the disease in the first place. And almost nothing, almost no attention, almost no money, almost no energy is being spent on trying to prevent Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease or ALS. Sometimes I think I wake up in the morning, I think about preventing Parkinson's disease. That's what I do. When I come in the morning, I'm thinking about preventing Parkinson's and other brain diseases. But I think there are really, really few people like me in the country and the world, and we need to get more and more people involved. Just because we live in a world without typhus, we live in a world without polio, we live in a world without smallpox. These are all diseases that we have said goodbye to. It is long overdue for us to say goodbye to Parkinson's disease.
And just to be clear, I'm all for prevention and having good treatment strategies, but I also think that we need to put a bunch of focus in the middle of people that have been exposed, and
100%.
they're not just sitting there like a ticking time bomb waiting for things to
or
go
sitting
off.
duck.
Like you said, testing. Let's see what's going on in the body chemical-wise, and then let's look at procedures we can use to clean that up to prevent that middle group from ever getting Parkinson's.
So let's talk about pesticides. So pesticides are, many of them are designed to kill insects, and they're designed to kill the insects by damaging the nervous system. Not terribly surprising that if you get exposed to some of these pesticides or insect-killing chemicals, that they might damage your nervous system. And it's almost certain that a neurologist like me has seen people who develop neurological disorders because of exposure to pesticides. But until 3 months ago, or maybe 5 months ago, maybe 6 months ago, I work at a new organization called Atria Health and Research Institute, New York City. It's focused on moving healthcare from reactive sick care to proactive preventive care. Until 6 months ago, I had never ordered a pesticide level in my life. And now when I see someone with Parkinson's disease, I order pesticide levels, I order levels of metals, and I check their urine for trichloroethylene. Because if I can find these chemicals in them, then we're going to open the door to figure out why are they getting exposed to these chemicals, even if it's been years after the fact. And maybe it's gone in their body from now, but for some people, they still might be drinking the well water, for example, and they still might be getting exposed to pesticides. We can find these chemicals in them. We can take action to reduce that exposure, and then we can think about what interventions can we think about to reduce the risk of progression or lower the risk of ever getting the disease. The guy I'm sitting right next to is Dr. Rob Kochko. He's a fantastic naturopathic doctor, and he's teaching me about all types of things I didn't know anything about because, I grew up going to medical school, and we're really taught to be deeply skeptical of these alternative approaches. But I think there's some truth to some of these alternative approaches. And we have missed the boat on addressing the root causes of many of these brain diseases.
When it comes to pesticides, what are the biggest areas of entry? You've mentioned golf courses a couple times. Obviously, non-organic produce. Talk to those, and then any other big areas we need to be aware of. To me, also, if you're living near a farming area where they're spraying these, you're going to be exposed. but I'll have you share your thoughts.
Yeah, so I'll tell you a story. So I told you that Parkinson's and related diseases, some of them begin in the gut. And one that we think begins in the gut is a disease called dementia with Lewy bodies. It's one of the most common forms of dementia in the United States after Alzheimer's disease. It's the disease that felled the great Robin Williams, and it wasn't described in the medical literature until 1976. Dementia with Lewy bodies is not described in medical literature until 50 years ago by a doctor named Dr. Kenji Kosaka in Japan, a psychiatrist who had a penchant for the microscope. And he said, I have someone who looks like they features of Parkinsonism and dementia. And when I looked at their brains, they had this misfolded protein, this Lewy bodies throughout their cerebral hemispheres. Because of Dr. Borkhammer's work, I said, what happened in the food and water supply in the decades preceding the onset of dementia with Lewy bodies in Japan? So I went back and I said, what can we find out? In World War II, we sprayed DDT to kill mosquitoes to prevent the transmission of malaria, and we prevented millions from getting malaria. After World War II, we started using DDT indiscriminately. And among the things we did was we sprayed it on the rice paddies in Japan. And the principal way by which humans get exposed to DDT is by ingesting it. And so it turned out that it was found in the water and I think in the rice in Japan. And when the Japanese measured DDT, which loves fat, this fat-loving chemical, it was absent in Japanese men. The study was done in men in the 1920s and 1930s. In the 1940s, it started to sneak up, 50s, 60s, and then it started to decrease after it was banned around 1971. And because the chemical is fat-loving, it's hard for us to pee out, so we store it. The only way we can really excrete it, one of the principal ways we excrete it, is when women nurse. And so they find the pesticide DDT and its metabolites in the breast milk of nursing women in Japan in the 1970s. I don't know. That dementia with Lewy bodies might have begun because of exposure to DDT and pesticides like that entering the food supply in Japan. We get rid of these chemicals in the food supply in Japan and the rest of the world. We get rid of new diseases like dementia with Lewy bodies. So there are other ways that we get exposed besides our food. We can be inhaling it, as we discussed. If you live near a farm, it turns out people who live near where paraquat raid, they're not the farmer. People who live near where paraquat raid, according to research by Dr. Beata Ritz and Kimberly Paul, have a doubling in their risk of Parkinson's disease. And then my colleague, Dr. Brittany Krasnelsing, this really smart geographer, and her colleague, Dr. Rodolfo Savica, showed that people who live within a mile of a golf course in Rochester, Minnesota, had a 126% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. Why is living near a golf course associated with an increased risk of Parkinson's? We don't know for certain, but it turns out that golf courses use up to 5 times as much pesticide per acre as do farms. And many of these chemicals could either contaminate the water supply, like well water, like we talked about earlier, or we can be breathing in these chemicals and giving you perhaps predisposing you to this nose or brain first form of the disease. And these pesticides are everywhere. I think in our book, in process of writing the book, I learned that pesticides are routinely sprayed on kids' schools and playgrounds. In the United States, we spray pesticides, many of which are nerve toxins, on kids' schools and playgrounds. And we had the audacity to ask why 1 in 31 8-year-old children have autism, why people are getting intellectual disabilities in increasing numbers. Diseases have causes. If we stop the use of chemicals that are known to damage the nervous system, that damage the energy-producing parts of cells called mitochondria, of which your nerve cells are rich in these mitochondria, we can create a world without these diseases.
Is it true that golf courses have special exemptions when it comes to pesticides that are banned for the general public that they can still use?
A lot of tough questions for a neurologist, man. I'll tell you what, I don't know. I'll tell you the two of the pesticides that get me most concerned that are used on golf courses. One's called 2,4-D. Some of your listeners, many Vietnam veterans were exposed to Agent Orange. One of the components of Agent Orange was 2,4-D. So we are spraying on golf courses today a weed killer that we used in the time of warfare during Vietnam. We're using a same chemical that we used to spray on jungles over North Vietnam. We're spraying on golf courses. Another one's called chlorpyrifos. It's n- it, it's known to affect the nervous system of insects. That's how it works. It used to be used to kill bugs inside apartments in New York City. My colleague, Dr. Virginia Rao at Columbia University, found that children born to women in those apartments had the pesticide in their umbilical cord blood. And the higher the level in their umbilical cord blood, the lower the IQ of these children at ages 3, 5, and 7. And when she did MRIs of these children between 6 and 15 years of age, the higher the level of the chemical in their umbilical cord blood, the more structural brain abnormalities she saw on MRI. The pesticides estimated to have cost American children 26 million IQ points. EPA banned the chemical in 2021, but its manufacturers successfully sued to overturn that ban, allowing it to again be used on spraying on apple orchards and on golf courses. So we're allowing golf courses to be sprayed with a chemical that was used in Vietnam as component of Agent Orange, and we're allowing golf courses, depending on the state, to be sprayed with a insect-killing chemical that's estimated to cost 26 million American kids, 17 million IQ points, 17 million IQ points. I just think we're paying a really, 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 really high price, or it close to all shrink, and we're paying a really high and unnecessary price so that we have really green golf courses. We can come up with safer alternatives to dry cleaning. We can come up with safer pesticides for golf courses. And we can create a world with these diseases that just aren't happening.
Okay, let's make sure we give people the full playbook here when it comes to protecting. Pesticides we want to be aware of, TCE, PCE. What other major toxins have been related to Parkinson's?
I think the other big one is air pollution. So anyone been to Los Angeles has seen smog, and you see that, that brown layer of air. And when you look at that brown brown layer of air, what are you seeing? Well, you're seeing this little pieces of dirt and soot that are suspended in the air. Scientists call this particulate matter. Most of it we cough out or sneeze, but some are so small, 1/3 the width of my hair, that they can directly penetrate the nerve responsible for smell. So we're breathing in particulate matter that can go directly through the nerve responsible for smell and go back to that olfactory bulb, that smell center that's responsible, where the pathology of Parkinson's disease is thought to begin in a large number of individuals. Hitchhiking on that little pieces of dirt and soot are toxic metals, lead from gasoline, until it was banned. I forgot when it was banned in the United States. Iron from brakes, platinum from catalytic converters. And we know many of these toxic metals are implicated in the misfolding of proteins, including alpha-synuclein in Parkinson's disease, and likely in proteins implicated in Alzheimer's disease. We also know that the first place that the pathology of both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's is found in many individuals is the smell center. We also know that one of the earliest features of both diseases is loss of smell, which precedes the tremor or the memory impairment in Alzheimer's disease by years, if not decades. We also know that the first United States president to ever get Alzheimer's disease was Ronald Reagan, who spent his young adulthood, and much of his adulthood in California and Los Angeles, in all likelihood breathing in very polluted air. When he was governor of California in the 1960s, he said air quality in Los Angeles was so bad we should ban unnecessary driving. If we heed the words of, President Reagan, of President Nixon, and create a world with clean water, clean air, and clean food, we create a world without many of these brain diseases and without many other medical conditions as well.
All right, let's bring head trauma in. How does that fit in with what we've discussed?
So head trauma is linked to many of these neurological disorders, and it's not terribly surprising that if you get a concussion that you have an increased risk of neurological disorders. I think a lot of this is an amplification of the risk. So a lot of people are exposed to these chemicals, but only a small minority of people with any exposure to any chemical get the disease. For example, only 15% of smokers get lung cancer. Only 5% of people who work with asbestos get mesothelioma. Not every farmer, the vast majority of farmers don't get Parkinson's, but if you get exposed to pesticides and you get head trauma, your risk is tripled according to one study. So I think what head trauma, repeated head trauma, can amplify the risk of people, especially who have other environmental exposures tied to the disease.
And what would be the biggest areas of head trauma?
Well, in the United States, again, I don't know, but I would think car accidents would be very high on the list. Ralph Nader in the 1960s said we should put seatbelts in cars. He said we take better care of eggs in grocery stores with egg cartons than we do of people in cars. Automobile industry said cars don't kill people, drivers kill people. And that we were going to bankrupt the automobile industry because we put seatbelts in cars. Because we put seatbelts in cars, people like you and me are alive today. And the automobile industry is doing really, really well. In fact, they are only adopt even more and more technologies to reduce the risk of injury to their credit. And we can all drive with a decreased risk of with a decreased risk of getting harmed in a car accident. Still a lot of work to be improved, but you can do this. So if you take action to prevent these diseases, you see huge benefits. In our book, we also talk about, I like to bike. I like to bike in New York City. I like to bike in Central Park. If you see a tall neurologist in Central Park on a bike, it might be me, but I wear a helmet. When you ski or skate, you should wear a helmet as well. And I think we should be a little bit more serious about sports. There are two women's soccer players, Brandi Chastain and Kim Akers. Both were on the, I think, 1996 World Cup winning soccer team for the United States. Both are concerned about head trauma. I think one of them said, the idea that we're hitting a ball that's kicked 50 feet in the air is probably not the wisest idea. And we know that repeated head trauma is associated with chronic traumatic encephalopathy and associated with Parkinsonism, associated with ALS. So I think we can do things to modify sports, not heading the ball in soccer or limiting in it. And I think we can be a little bit far more proactive in terms of our reducing exposure to head trauma in football. NFL's made efforts to reduce the levels of concussion. People are still watching more NFL. I think if you made it even safer, you might get even more people watching football and having their children participate in. But we should be very mindful of these head traumas. As I said before, these adult onset diseases are planted early. You don't want them planted early in your children.
Well, as you share that, it gets me thinking about kids and head trauma. A developing brain. Do we have research on susceptibility for kids versus adults?
There is on head trauma. I'm not well versed on that, but I'll tell you about chemicals. So if you're exposed to, this much chemical, it matters a lot if you're in your 50s and you're 6'5", or if you're 5 years old or 5 months old or in your mother's womb. We know that children are more likely to bring chemicals or things to their mouth. We know that children breathe more rapidly than adults. We know that children have a greater surface area to volume ratio than adults. We know that young children have a developing brain that's likely more susceptible to the toxic effects of these chemicals. We talked about Camp Lejeune, and we talked about how Marines who were average age were 20, some were teenagers, had a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's. I've now met 4 people who were either a child, like Brian Grant, who was a 3-year-old boy, the former NBA basketball player, when he 3 years old, when his father was a Marine at Camp Lejeune. He was likely drinking in, bathing in, breathing in these chemicals when he was a child there. 33 years later, he develops Parkinson's disease, including developing a tremor while still playing for the Los Angeles Lakers and the Phoenix Suns. I've met 4 people in total who were children or were conceived, including a woman who was conceived and never even actually born at Camp Lejeune, who developed Parkinson's disease at a young age. These diseases are planted early, and I think in some cases they might be planted as early as in your mother's womb.
How differently do your colleagues see what we've been talking about today? The ones that are thinking more conventionally.
So when I was in medical school, I went to the University of Pennsylvania, the oldest medical school in the country. I trained at one of the top neurology programs in the country. I was a division chief for Parkinson's disease at Johns Hopkins. And I thought, and I was taught, that Parkinson's disease was some combination of a natural consequence of aging, of genes, of bad luck, and maybe a word about pesticides. And I think that's largely wrong. Parkinson's disease is not a natural consequence of aging. You let someone, a mouse, age in the laboratory, it never develops spontaneously about Parkinson's disease. When Dr. Parkinson described the condition in London, there were 1 million people living in London. About up to 10% of them were over the age of 60 in 1800 London. That's about 100,000 people with 100,000 60-year-olds in London. Right now, in the United States, about 1% of people over 60 get Parkinson's disease. That would mean that there were upwards of 1,000 people who would have had Parkinson's disease in London when Dr. Parkinson described it. He described 6. This is not a natural consequence of aging, no more than lung cancer is a natural consequence of aging. The disease becomes more common as you age, just like lung cancer becomes more common as you age. But lung cancer in 1900 in the United States largely didn't exist. Lung cancer did not largely exist in the United States until 25 years after cigarettes were introduced. When we stopped smoking in the 1970s, 25 years later, see a corresponding decline in lung cancer. So longevity allows the disease to appear because it takes years, decades for the pathology to spread and for the enough nerve cells to die off to produce the symptoms. But aging is not a natural, these diseases aren't a natural consequence of aging. We've told you that only 13% of people carry a genetic cause or genetic risk factor for disease. And bad luck may play a small role in the disease in determining who among the exposed get the disease and who doesn't. There might be an element of chance in that. But I think these chemicals are largely man-made. These diseases are largely man-made. Parkinson's disease is largely a man-made disease. The sooner we recognize that, and my colleagues are slowly coming around to this, but the real credit for this goes to people like women, especially women scientists, Dr. Caroline Tanner, who for 40 years has been telling us the principal causes of Parkinson's are not our gene, but their environment. She, in her 30s, went to China. Imagine a 30-year-old American female neurologist going to China to investigate the environmental causes of Parkinson's disease. My colleague at the University of Rochester, Dr. Debbie Korschlecht, in 1998 or 1999, showed that paraquat, when laboratory animals were exposed to paraquat, they moved around less and they developed the features of the disease when they looked at their brains. My colleague, Dr. Beata Ritz, for decades has been telling us about the role of environmental causes in Parkinson's disease and showing that people who are exposed to these chemicals after they've been diagnosed have a faster rate of progression. If we pay attention to many of these scientists, many of them women, we would not be in the place where we are today.
For somebody who already developed or goes on to develop Parkinson's, given your expertise in this area, what's the best they can do once they have the disease, treatment-wise?
I think there are 3 things you can do. I think the course of of Parkinson's is far more modifiable than we thought, or far more modifiable than I thought. And I think we know that the course is variable. So we know there are people who do really well for long periods of time, and we know that people who don't do well. We know that there are people who are in physically better shape after they've been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease than they were before they had Parkinson's disease. If that's not evidence that this disease is modifiable, I'm not sure what is. So what are the things you can do? 1, stop getting exposed to these chemicals. And our book will give you 25 ways to do that. 2, exercise. Exercise releases growth factors in the brain that likely protect the nerve cells that are under attack. I think the attack is ongoing. The pathology is still being spread. So you want to protect the remaining nerve cells by stop fueling the fire. No more chemicals coming in through your gut or through your nose that are tied to the disease. And by releasing growth factors to protect the nerve cells that want to fight off the spread of this misfolded protein. And then the third thing, I think, is getting really good care. We know that people who see a Parkinson's specialist are less likely to fracture their hip, less likely to be placed in a skilled nursing facility, and less likely to die prematurely. It's not proof that that's what's causing it, but it's pretty good evidence. And so sometimes if you go to Parkinson's Center of Excellence, fantastic, but only 9% of Americans see a Parkinson's specialist like me. We, Parkinson's specialists, need to come up with better ways of making care from us and our expertise and our knowledge more accessible to do that. Have podcasts to help us, hopefully reach millions of people to do that. Books can do that. This information should be democratized. It should be freely accessible to anyone. anywhere, so we can slow the rate of progression of the disease for those who already have it and make sure that their children and grandchildren never get the disease themselves. Let our generation be the generation that brings about to the fall of Parkinson's disease.
What about levodopa? What is
Oh,
that and
yeah.
how can it help people?
Yeah, so there actually are medical treatments for Parkinson's disease. It's good that we've gone this far without a doctor talking about medicine. The nice thing about Parkinson's is that it's treatable from a medical standpoint. We've known from the 1960s that brains of people with Parkinson's have lower levels of a chemical and neurotransmitter called dopamine in their brain than people who are unaffected by a disease. Led to them, doctors who come here with the brilliant thought, we'll give people dopamine. Unfortunately, that didn't work. People got really nauseous. And then we just gave them a precursor to dopamine called levodopa. And if you've seen the movie Awakenings with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro's talking about the first, some of the first administrations of levodopa to create awakenings in people who had a Parkinsonism due to a virus. So levodopa is highly effective for people with Parkinson's disease, as are some other medications, which in the laboratory have been shown to slow the rate of progression of the disease, and in humans, modest benefit, drugs like forsageline and sledgeline. And then for people who have been taking those medicines, responded well to those treatments, and have developed complications, periods where the medicine works well and periods where it doesn't work well, or they move around too much, there are surgical treatments like deep brain stimulation, which are highly effective for people with Parkinson's disease. You know, Parkinson's is not a death sentence. One of my colleagues, Larry Gifford, head of the PD Avengers, says this is a life sentence. It changes your life. You can still live long, productive lives with Parkinson's disease. We've had people walk in space with Parkinson's disease. I told you about Brian Grant, who likely played the whole NBA season after he had Parkinson's disease. We've had people serve in Congress. We've had people serve in the Senate. We've had people serve in the cabinet. And we've had the head of the Catholic Church with a Parkinsonian disorder. So people can live long, productive lives with it, but they got to stop getting exposed to these chemicals. They got to exercise and they got to get really good care. And we need to make that care more accessible to more people.
Where do you see technology, things like AI, taking treatment in the next 10 years?
I think that one of the earliest places we're going to see this is diagnosis. Right now, the way you get diagnosis, you see someone like me and you give it a history of, a tremor, and we examine you and you have slowness of movement and maybe a little bit of decreased arm swing or a little trouble with your walking. But people like me get the diagnosis wrong 10 to 20% of the time. I just found out the other day that I got the diagnosis wrong on a patient I've been caring for a few years. So I think we need better ways of diagnosing it. One of my colleagues, Dr. Asan Hoke, who's a really top-notch computer scientist at University of Rochester, has showed that simple analysis of videos of people speaking, of people tapping their thumb and index finger, of people smiling can identify people with Parkinson's disease. My colleague, Dr. Dina Katabi, a MacArthur-winning computer scientist at MIT, came up with a device she calls Emerald. It's a radio wave sensor that she showed could look at nocturnal breathing signals and not only diagnose people with Parkinson's who already had the disease, but identify people who would later be diagnosed with Parkinson's even before they did that. And that was by looking at the breathing signals of people at night while they're sleeping, something that I don't think very few of my colleagues would ever think would be possible. I think we're coming to the time where, your watch, your toilet, your car, your bed is going to identify people with early features of the disease and identify people much earlier in the course and offer the opportunity, as you were suggesting, for interventions to delay the onset, postpone the onset of the disease. And maybe we come with technologies that better assess the safety of our food, our water, and our air so that people never get exposed or reduce their exposure to these chemicals at the outset.
Speak to the person newly diagnosed. Somebody, you can even be the one diagnosing them as a neurologist, letting them know that their life is going to change in a profound way. How would you share that?
First, I want to see someone with Parkinson's, I get pissed off because I think Parkinson's, in the words of Michael J. Fox, sucks, and that they're going to suffer a lot, and that this suffering is needless and preventable. And suffering might be part of the human condition, but needless, preventable suffering should not be. And we should be taking action to prevent people from ever getting this disease in the first place. And the failure of us to do so is why Parkinson's disease is one of the fastest growing brain diseases. And I want that failure to end so that people aren't coming to my office and that I'm not making the diagnosis of the disease. I want to put myself out of business. Now, obviously, I don't say that at clinic because that's not a very empathetic way to do it. So, there's no two ways around it. This is a bad disease, but people can live long and productive lives with it. We've seen Michael J. Fox win an incredible example. Since he spent over half his life with Parkinson's disease. He spent over half his life with Parkinson's disease. For 30 years, he's not only bared the burden of a disease that's terrible, he has reduced that burden for millions, if not tens of millions of people around the world by reducing the stigma and by creating a foundation that's seeking to advance our understanding of the disease and taking political action and more policy actions to ban some of these chemicals linked to it. Since he's had Parkinson's disease, he's written 4 books and been on, countless sitcoms. He's even with Harrison Ford and a great little vignette on the TV series Awakening. So people can live long, healthy, and productive lives with Parkinson's disease. I tell them about the 3 ways to slow your progression, to stop being exposed to these chemicals, exercise, and hopefully we're going to help them get really good care. And I think we can do a little bit more in terms of measuring these chemicals in their bodies to make sure they're not getting exposed and really get to answer the question of what's fueling the rise of the disease. But I tell them an optimist. I try to give them as much hope as possible and realistic hope that people can live long, healthy lives. And I tell them that we can take action to prevent their kids and grandkids from ever getting the disease. At some point, when any of us is diagnosed with a condition, we think about our children if we have children. And we don't want our kids to suffer the same things that we suffered from. We want to learn from those experiences and prevent them from suffering the same fate as we do.
What do you say to the loving partner who wants to be there to support somebody newly diagnosed or loving children?
I think that I've come up short here. We know that there are over 35 million carers in the United States. And the number one reason that people care for another adult are brain diseases. And we know that carers have adverse health consequences themselves and are increased risk of death just from the mere act likely of caregiving. It's hard to be a caregiver. It's brutal. And sometimes it gets worse over time. And carers, say a spouse, generally gets older over time and they're caring for someone who's getting older themselves and less able. And so their physical ability to care for people gets reduced over time. It's almost the opposite of childhood. I think we need to pay a lot more attention. I think we need to give people breaks from being a caregiver. They need respites. They need breaks. You can't be a caregiver, very highly effective caregiver if you're stressed and strained yourself. So we need to think about ways of reducing this, whether that's a respite care, someone else coming into the home, whether it's adult daycare centers. But there needs to be something that so people aren't 24/7 doing this for 10, 20, 30 years is just quite frankly too much.
Hearing you talk about Parkinson's, it's obvious your passion. You've dedicated your life to this disease and putting a stop to it. How did you get so fired up about it?
I think I got fired up. I was largely like most of my colleagues and, trying to come up with better ways of caring for the disease and better treatments. And that's what I was doing until I had the gift of a sabbatical in 2018. And I was wondering how Parkinson's went from 6 people affecting 6 people in the streets of London with a disease that wasn't described in the medical literature for the world's fastest growing brain disease in just 200 years. Our genes don't change that much. Aging alone doesn't explain it. It's growing much faster than other age-related diseases like Alzheimer's and stroke. And I read the work of my colleague, Dr. Caroline Tanner. I literally went to Google Scholar. I typed in Caroline Tanner and I read for best or top hits. And I was like, wow, how come I didn't know this? I knew a little bit about the pesticides, but I was like, how come I didn't know this? She says, Ray, do you know about trichloroethane? Do you know about camptothecin? I go, no. And I started it. And then we've been doing a listening tour. After our first book came out, I visited communities, Superfund sites in New York State. I went hang out with the Superfund sites. I did a Midwest listening tour, and then we've been doing a national listening tour. I visited 40-some cities in the last 6-7 months around the United States, everything from Medford, Oregon to Tallahassee, Florida. And I listen to the stories of people affected by the disease. And I ask them, if they don't ask me a question, I ask them how they got Parkinson's. And I've met a woman who was a teenager was holding up the flag to tell the crop duster where to dump pesticides in South Dakota, and she developed Parkinson's disease. I met a man in Fresno, California, who says, I know how I got Parkinson's. I was dumping paraquat on fields in California. I met a woman who was in wheelchair bound with her husband, and they came up to me and said that when she was 6 months old, she was living at Camp Lejeune when her father was an officer based in the Arctic Circle. And she and her mom were likely drinking in this chemical linked to Parkinson's disease. 30-some years later, she got Parkinson's. 30-some years later, that she's in a wheelchair, even though she was an athlete, a marathoner before. I was in Livonia, Michigan, outside of Detroit, and highlighted a TC contaminated site from a metal plating factory, a lot of automobile industry, and near Detroit. 4 people who came up to me afterwards said I either worked in that automobile factory or I lived above or near that plume of the trifluoroethylene in the groundwater. And they have Parkinson's disease. You hear enough of these stories, you listen, and you know the science, you know the research, and you come away really convinced that this is a preventable disease. And I think it's on me that the Parkinson's disease is rising. Colleagues like me answered the bell in New York City when HIV was running rampant. After a delayed start, they got really serious about finding out what the cause was. People didn't know what the cause of HIV was. It wasn't known to be a virus. Retroviruses, which HIV is, were largely minimally known at the time. And now today, HIV is more treatable than more people receive appropriate treatment for HIV than they do for Parkinson's disease. HIV is preventable with a condom. And the number of new cases of HIV is at its lowest level since 1990. HIV might disappear as a major clinical entity because of the heroism of ACT UP and other advocates. We should be doing the same thing for Parkinson's disease. It's on people like me, quite frankly, I think on my colleagues as well, to answer the bell so that we address what's now one of the world's fastest growing brain diseases and bring about its fall.
Somebody that's tuned into this point, they want to protect themselves and their family. We've shared a lot here. What are 3 things they can do after this conversation to take action?
That was in Traverse City, Michigan, giving a talk to 250 people, many in fact with Parkinson's, and I asked how many drink water from a well, and 80% of the hands went up. I got nauseous because I don't want people who already have the disease to still be getting exposed. So if you have a well, go get a carbon filter today underway home, put it on your faucet so you stop getting exposed to chemicals that harmful chemicals that might be in your water, and then test it. I think an air purifier is really helpful. I think many brain diseases that the front door, that our nose is the front door to our brain. The nose is the front door to our brain. So I really worry about chemicals that we inhale. When they come in through the nose, they bypass the productive gut. They bypass our liver, which is in charge of detoxifying chemicals, and they gain preferential entry into our brain. So I think an air purifier is really helpful for people who live in polluted parts of the country. And quite frankly, if you don't think you do, I think it might be helpful. And then I think we got to be really serious about the pesticides that are in our food. So many of these fat-loving pesticides get concentrated up when they make their way up the food chains. When you eat cheese or eat meat or fat, you're likely could be eating increased concentrations of these pesticides. So buy organic, especially for meat and dairy products, and then wash all your fruits and vegetables with water and maybe a pesticide wash or salt or vinegar. So organic produce and reduce your exposure to pesticides in the food you eat. A carbon filter, especially if you're drinking well water, to reduce exposure in your water, and then an air purifier to reduce your exposure in your air. In addition to these 3, we get to 22 more in the book, and there are likely others that can be done to take action.
All right, Ray, we're going to end it there for today. Really enjoyed round 2. I appreciate you. The work you're doing is so important. Keep up the great work. We're going to link up your books, your social media, your website, everything in the show notes. Thank you.
Yeah. And then look, we're the same generation, and I think we're thirsting for a calling. We want to do something great. Why not be the generation that brings about the end of these diseases? Generations before us have brought about the fall of polio. Generations before us has brought about the decline of drinking and driving. Generations before us have brought about or bringing about the fall of HIV. Why don't we bring about the fall of autism? Why don't we bring about the fall of Parkinson's disease? Why don't we bring about the fall of Alzheimer's disease? And not by a pill, but by taking action to prevent people from ever getting these diseases in the first place.
I love it. I'm with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Stick around here for this other great interview. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
What if your healthy diet has been the problem all along? That's what a lot of people are discovering. There's real power in feeding your brain properly and letting it try to heal itself. Nutrition and brain metabolism.